Okay, so in our last section here, what I'll be doing is going through the basic, simple, or simplified landmarks of the arms and legs, and then we'll talk about the very last step to our process, which is perspective. And we've done that already for the torso, the rib cage, and pelvis. The head's going to get its own week separate to that. So what I'll be using for the perspective here is either basic cylinders or a long flattened kind of boxes. So let's jump back up and start again with the arm. And I'm going to give just again a few kind of simplified ideas for how to organize it or put it together. The scapula we put in is a fine shape. It's something I use uh, simple. If you wanted to make it a little bit more accurate, one thing that you could do is slightly offset it from that triangle that's perfectly parallel to the spine. So the angle of the scapula isn't perfectly straight. It's functionally straight for my drawing process because it's an easier relationship to see with the spine. But this is something I'd always do is, for every step or shape that you're looking at, try to give it the most general, um, memorable, and or iconic shape that you can think of. And then as you get more comfortable and are able to kind of deal with the information and the stacking, then make it more specific or more organic or more direct. That also goes for the process. Instead of having all these steps, once you integrate this thinking and become comfortable with it, you can combine or collapse steps. So a suggestion as to how to do that here would be slightly offset that angle, and then I'll give a tiny triangle on top or like a shark fin. And then for the spine of the scapula, I would always create an S curve. And this will be the part leading into the acromion process there. So you have options, right? It could be kind of a very clean and perfect looking triangle. If you're feeling like you'd like to advance that a little bit more so you have a more organic result sooner, this would be a solution, maybe two triangles and an S. So now in terms of placing the arms as they come down from the shoulder to the head are roughly, I'm sorry, the shoulder to the hand are roughly three heads. And that's something that could be really useful if you just have an arm down at the side. So let's imagine here that we have the scapula coming from behind. So that would be kind of this much here that I'm seeing in the front. And so let's color that in. What I usually do in terms of proportion is look for larger relationships in terms of where landmarks of the arm might line up. So either is fine, right? You could count down and do your three heads from here down to the end of the arm, or you can look for relationships in terms of where things line up. So in terms of designing, now let's think of basic shapes that we could think of or use for the arm. When I start it, I always create a sphere or the head of the humerus. And so again, keep in mind you can make this complex and descript or simple and geometric. I'll leave a little bit of a squared edge to the top, rounder on the inside. And then as the um, bone moves down, or the shaft of the humerus, it'll thin. You see a little bump here about halfway down where the deltoid would attach. And then it gets broader again at the end. So one thing that I look for as it starts to move down here is the medial epicondyle, or the funny bone, lining up with the bottom of the rib cage. And so I always kind of look for the arm to be, when it's at rest here on the side, on that arc or on that relationship. So if I can find this, in other words, I can maybe track or swing curves, S or C curves out to place the end of the elbow. And then here'd be the lateral epicondyle, and that's a little bit rounder. Okay, so it could be left like this. You don't have to do anything more. I'll take it sometimes a step further, and here's some suggestions for how you could describe that simply, right? So one thing that I want to be able to do at a certain point is track any type of rotation in the arm. And that'll be important for thinking about how the arm can shift and rotate and then track the muscles of the upper arm as they move and roll with that. So in order to do that, I try to get a little bit clearer here at the bottom. One shape that you can use is a bow tie. Right? So even though it's here, we've designed this as an asymmetry or something with difference. One thing I also think of is kind of like a bow tie. So we can think of this as a hinge joint. And that it's a little bit easier to see or design. It's still also pretty geometric, so shouldn't be overly complicated in terms of the structure. But what it will do is, let's say I'm just trying to see and design the bone, but I want to show that it can also turn, right? That there's medial or lateral rotation in the humerus. If I want to say show the arm turning in, so let's think of it swinging in this way, right? I can start to take this part here, or the side of the bow tie, and then understand it as a cylinder. And this would give me it's not a, a really complex description of space, but it's a shorthand for how much I'm seeing that arm roll in. Right? Or if I want to think of the arm rolling even more so, I'll just continue to open that ellipse and then foreshorten the arm. So I would say this is maybe a little bit more of a complex understanding of the joint, but it's one that you could also use for the knee if you like, and it helps with solving some of the anatomical, what I think are things that are really difficult around positioning the muscles in the upper arm. So those are two suggestions. You could go even simpler though, right? Like I could just say, I don't even need to draw the shape at all because I'm going to put a cylinder over that. So what if I just said the humerus is a ball, a stick, a triangle, in a curve or something like that. And it's just signage or abstraction so that you can place the amount of information you need to build this up. As we move down, right, so let's put the ideas for the radius and the ulna. First, when thinking of their placement in terms of lining things up, I try to just think of the wrist ending at the top of the hip. Right, so that would be the great trochanter of the femur. And that's something we still have yet to cover. So here's the idea, that's the length. Now, what I'm going to start to think about in terms of the big structures of the bones. So we have two there. We have radius and ulna. And we're going to start by drawing just a design for a supinated hand, and then we can discuss pronating it. For the ulna, it has a larger head at the top, the olecranon, and then it narrows down to the styloid process of the ulna. So what do I do with that? Big triangle, it gets small. So it starts broad and then narrows to a point that you would see as your um, wrist bone nearest to your pinky, or right next to and leading to your pinky. Right, so it can be complicated, but we can always think of these things in summary shapes or basic abstractions. Just maybe triangle for now. If the hand is supinated, so that means that the hand would be kind of facing away, or the thumb would be facing away, the palm would be up. And I think this is a really common way of thinking of this idea, but let's say this is the hand here. At the supinated position, you would see the hand like this, palm up, and then someone could hold soup. So here's soup. As soon as you, it's warm soup, as soon as you move away from that, right, so pronation, which would be the opposite, then the soup would fall out of the bowl and you could play pro basketball because your palm would be facing down. So supination versus pronation. The radius and the ulna for supination are next to each other. So the radius will be the exact opposite in design of the ulna. So take your triangle and then flip it. Here's the end, that's the ulna. This is the radius on top. This side, the bottom of the radius where it's heaviest, widest is going to lead and follow the thumb. So you can always track the radius by looking at your thumb or subject's thumb. So if I'm thinking of that same thing here, you could think of a small portion, and then in supination, we'd see these bones next to each other. And then kind of follow that away. This is the line of your hip, that over. If I'm going to make something that's pronation, or I'm at a landmark stage like what we're at, tracking and leaving summary descriptions of pronation, I would just make an X. So this is supination. The alternative would be pronation. So let's say I have that same arm. I would think of the radius going across. So I would put an X instead of two parallel lines. And that's normally what I would do. Right? I don't draw, when I'm setting up my drawings for these shapes, I don't draw triangles or really complex forms. I would do, as an indication or something to remember by, parallel versus an X, or pronation versus supination. Right? So in pronation, this is going to move over and then in. So that's it for radius and ulna. It's good to just make parallel or X, and if you want to make it more complicated, you can from there. Then the last thing that I do is the hand, and it's kind of ghosted, but normally what I'll do for the hand, just in laying it out, is take it halfway down the femur. Right? I had a tendency, or I think I still do a little bit, to make hands too short, so I always will think of it ending or relate it to it ending relationship-wise the end of the femur. Or I'm sorry, the middle of the femur. I still screw it up even when talking. So that's my basic summary or ideas for arms. Front view. Why don't we do also the back view very quickly? It's all going to be more or less very similar. Do it on this side. So you can see I've already laid it in a little bit. Things that I think would be worth pointing out just to make sure that we're clear on different views would be, here's our straight and our ball. We can make that triangle or bow tie here. So what I'll do that's maybe only slightly different from the back is I track the ulna. So if I have this straight line here for the back, I'll put a sphere for where the hinge joint of the ulna is. And then whenever this sphere is in a straight line with the medial and the lateral, I know the arm is extended or straight. If there's any kind of bend to the arm, I always track this difference, or how much the ulna is going to move outside of that hinge joint. So this would be the flexion of the arm, right? And so that will give me a triangle of some degree, right? If the arm would be bent, so maybe at that stage the arm is bent, and so radius and ulna are up there. That's the big difference for the back view of the arm in terms of pattern or summary. The tracking of the X or the parallel lines for pronation and supination is the same here. If we look at the side view, so let's put on a scapula shape. What I do for the side is always lift the scapula to the clavicle. So our clavicle would be here. So acromion and then scapula. If I'm going to draw the scapula from any view other than front or back, remember it's just foreshortening the triangle, just showing it as thinner as opposed to the width it would hold in the back. The shapes would be the same. So here's where I'm kind of placing or thinking for the end of the humerus. Start with my sphere. One thing that you can kind of see from the side is more of a curvature to the bone, but doesn't have to be a big deal. If you don't want, you could just have it be the same type of straight line. Right? And then now what I would be seeing is the outside of that bow tie shape. So I give it a little bit of a curve. And then I would just kind of go through and start to place the same basic ideas for radius and ulna, right down to the hip is the wrist. I could do my X or my straights, and then halfway down would be the hand. So really simple because cylinders are going to get layered over this. So I only want enough that I can see important things for muscle or perspective later. And I do keep it as simple or as simple as I can for the legs as well. And there's a lot of similarity in the shape. Maybe the biggest difference or thing that I think is important here would be starting the legs. So I begin the basic design for the great trochanter of the femur 2/3 of the way down. And now I'm working on this flat plane, right, as opposed to the rounded box because we've cut into this. And it would even be more accurate to make this slightly angled, but that's all stuff you could build to. So I think of this area, right, as a doorknob, and for a couple of reasons, right? If I'm thinking of the side of the pelvis, so this is that plane but turned, I would go 2/3 of the way down, 2/3, and then make a doorknob. So here's the stem, kind of the cylindrical portion that pushes off the door, and then here's a rounder handle that you could grab. And this is a way that I think about it just because it helps me remember the difference here from a sense of depth, right? That the side of the leg or the side of the pelvis will have the leg push off of it. So there's some distance, and then there's a slight irregularity or a difference in this portion to the head of the femur. So it could look like a mushroom, could look like whatever you want it to look like. But I find it useful for thinking of form and the structure of the hip later. So here's my doorknob, or great trochanter. So this is something that you have to, not get confused by, hopefully, when I'm talking, is I have a lot of pet names for shapes or simplifications. So if I'm not maintaining the same type of analytical or descriptive rigor that Scott would, well, like I cautioned you earlier, you should really be taking his class for that. Mine is just, or this class was really just to confuse you. No, it's just, again, to summarize and to make process friendly the, the difficult information that you'll get from Scott. And so now femur, same structure to the humerus in the sense that I'm working from thick to thin and then back to thick again as we start to move towards the knee, which I'm standing on that half head or halfway point between heads 5 and 6 in our measurements. And so this was head 5, this was head 6, and so I always put the knee halfway between them, or stand the knee halfway there. And so here's our medial, which means middle, and lateral epicondyle. And you could do the same thing here if you wanted to make a bow tie. That's a useful shape or something that you found valuable. You can use the same thing here. And then I always will stand the patella over. And so this to me looks like another Legend of Zelda shield or triangle. Um, so however you want to design it and think in simple terms is fine. Okay, so that would be a basic summary idea for femur. From there, when thinking of the fibula and tibia, I'll do two bones. So the tibia is going to be the larger one. And so I always make underneath the femur a triangle, and that points at the tibial tuberosity. Just kind of comes directly down from the femur there. This would be the plateau or the area that the femur will swing across. And then I'll just take a straight down to the inside ankle or medial malleolus. This I also, when I think of the lower leg or the ankle, imagine is on an asymmetrical tilt. So that's my tibia line. Fibula, I'll put right next to at the very top there, or slightly down. And then this is just going to be a straight line, right? And then I'm done. Right, so it's slightly lower than the tibia. And then we're going to do hands and feet later. So this is just now my triangle placeholder for foot. Okay, so that's done. The back view is exactly the same, minus the patella, at least in the way that I lay it in. So there's no difference there other than when I end or create my bow tie shape or my box here, I'm not going to be putting that patella shape. That's just for the front, obviously. For the side, um, like we talked about a little bit earlier, I do give a bit more of a curvature to the femur. So again, thinking, I find my pelvis plane, I measure about 2/3 of the way down, make my doorknob, then curvature the femur. I like to exaggerate this. And then for the bottom, same proportion. And then sometimes more of an egg here, because again, or sphere or ovoid, because we're seeing inside the bow tie. And then I'll leave the back a little bit broader, and then the patella here. Different from the front, instead of just the triangle pointing down to the tuberosity or the pronounced area of bone there, I'll make a platform and then send the triangle forward. That points at the same area, and then I can make my straight, or you can curve it a bit if you want. And if I'm seeing the outside, I'll do a small sphere for the fibula and then straight down, always a little bit lower. So simple, hopefully, symbols or descriptive qualities to these arms and legs. And now let me show you how I would place them in the context of drawing. Let's just do the front view so that we don't take too much time in getting through this.